Hello. Oh, I don't know if I'm if I'm supposed to. I'm not really making a presentation here. I don't have anything planned. I'm open to any of your questions, or that's basically the format. I don't have any uh, sort of specific. I'm not giving a talk and I'm not performing anything. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to respond. I can see your questions over to the side. Um, so okay, I'm okay. I see. So any questions? Anything you'd like me to talk about? Okay, I'm not really performing on this. um, okay, so I got a question. um, oh wow. Okay, lots of stuff. Okay, all right. So I have a question from. Uh, okay, we have. Let's see. There's a hello, cello fans. We're thrilled. Answer each as it comes in. Okay. Tell us about your background. I have that. Um, all right. So you can probably find things about my background online if you go to Indiana University and the website and look at the string department. Um, and there's a bio, and so you can see all the things. As far as my background, um, uh, as far as my background, it depends on whether you mean like early background or my professional background. That's a big question. So if you can be specific about that, I could maybe give you. All right. Building stamina for long pieces such as the Bach cello suites. I find tension builds up in my shoulders and hand muscles after playing for a while. Okay. All right. So that question, I think is a good one for me to answer. All right. So first of all, when people tell me they have issues with stamina, or they have issues with tension in their shoulders, I think one of the first things that we can do is talk about how to raise your arms. And a lot of times, I think that's sort of at the sort of the heart of that issue with when people feel tension in here. And I can sort of show a little bit so you can see a little bit more. But so one of the things is just what are the muscles that raise the arms? And actually, the primary muscles that support the arms are in the back. These muscles on the side back here are called the latissimus dorsi muscles. And those muscles are the ones that actually support the entire shoulder and hold the shoulder up. So when you raise your arms, there are various ways that you can sort of feel that. But if you think of kind of raising your arms to the side and kind of from the elbow, feel the elbow going up. Let's see if I can position myself so you can see it. That when you raise the elbow, that the shoulder doesn't go up, but rather keep the shoulder down. And then you can feel that muscle in the back, you'll feel a little contraction back here. And that's a big muscle, and it has a lot of that's where your stamina is. That's what holds your arms up, are those muscles in the back. And those make it possible for you to be suspended for a long period of time. And what the times when you get tension in your shoulders is when you try to raise them more from the trapezius, which is this muscle right here, which is that's the muscle that does this. And so the idea is to kind of hold your arms up like without raising your shoulders, so that this is as released as possible in the trapezius muscle, and that the deltoid muscles, those are the ones that are on the sides, those are the ones that are designed to move the arm, okay? So if they're kind of holding, they're tense and they're holding the arms up and they're trying to move, that's when you get really tired. Over time, it starts to really kind of burn in there. And so if you're holding it up from the back, the muscles in your arms are suspended, then you can hold your arms up for a very long time. Now, it takes some practice to get the feel for that, but once you get a feel for it, it really is quite easy. But it does take some practicing to kind of get used to that feeling. And it's sort of, if you think about like the way a dancer holds themselves, when they raise their arms, they don't raise their shoulders, they raise their arms, but their shoulders are kind of more down, like not pushing down, but just not raised. So that way you can kind of play for a long time and feel comfortable. And as far as the tension in the fingers, that, and the tired hand thing where, you just feel like you can't, you kind of run out of steam in the hand. Basically, what makes muscles tired and tense is when they don't release. The longer that they're contracted, the more tired they get. And that's just for very simple reasons as to what fuels the muscle. It's oxygen. And the oxygen keeps flowing into the muscle to give it strength. But after a while, if it doesn't ever release, it can't get any more oxygen anymore, and then it starts to fail, and that's when you feel like you just can't push your fingers down anymore. So the idea is to when you're playing a finger, that you that's when you need the initially you need to strike the note, but then after that you release it. Okay, so one of the classic examples of this is in the E flat suite, and people always that's one of the ones where that's the most challenging, because you don't have that one extra open string to use, so that means you're kind of using 25-30% more effort throughout the entire piece. And then you get to the jig and you have all those extensions that you have to play. And so there, I can give you an example of that where what I would do is kind of, you see, if I kind of focus my weight on the one finger and release the other fingers, see that? So I kind of strike the note. And so you can see what's happening when I play the B flat. This note, this finger immediately releases instead of like this, you see? And you can even do it really fast. See, that's so it's just, it can go very quickly. You see, I'm just releasing all the notes immediately. Now, that takes a lot of time to sort of develop the ability to do that. You have to be very patient, and you have to kind of spend a lot of time going really slow to get used to it, okay? So that's two things that you can do to help stamina when you're playing a Bach suite, both the left hand releasing and then the holding your arms up. You know, actually you can't really see I can change this a little bit, but you can see my arm is, I know there's a delay, it looks like there's a delay, but hopefully you can sort of see that. What is the sensation in your fingers as you change the bow direction for lyrical phrases? Okay. What is the sensation in your fingers as you change the bow direction? Okay. Oh boy. Okay. You mean like, it's the bow direction for lyrical phrases. I think you're kind of saying connecting it. I mean, I'm assuming when you're playing legato, something lyrical. Okay, so the sensation in the fingers. Well, I think the simplest thing to say about it is that what makes the most disturbance in a bow change is, and you may already know this, it's kind of stating the obvious, but sometimes it's so obvious that people don't always realize it. It's about the beginning of the new stroke doesn't happen fast enough. It's late. And so that's what causes the disturbance in the bow change. So the idea is to sort of have the bow prepared for the new stroke. And the more prepared it is, the more immediately the sound will continue. And that involves a variety of things. And the fingers do actually play a role in that, in part. So I can maybe demo that a little bit. So when I'm saying in preparation for the new stroke, that means several things that you can do. Oh, yes, and I should mention, the other thing is, the idea is with the bow changes is that they are, that you want to try to keep everything in motion. What often makes a problem in a break is when everything stops and then everything starts again. The idea is to have it kind of be more of a circular kind of motion. And so the arm, everything plays a role in that, but the fingers do play a role. They're part of it. So let's say when I'm at the frog, the way I do it is like this. So at the tip, let's see, everything is backwards, so I have to kind of figure it out. Okay, I guess, no, it's not going to be that way. Okay, I'll get used to it. But so at the tip, that means, so you can see what my fingers are actually doing. What I do is basically, this is the position that I want to start the stroke, which is sort of like, basically, it's like I'm going like this and like that. So my fingers are doing that. And they're also doing this. they're rotating the bow. So you probably can see it a little bit if I go sideways. Boy, this is really confusing because it's the opposite of what I would think. But let's say, so when I go at the tip, you can see I'm kind of going, so I'm going on towards the A string on the down bow, and then towards the G string on the up bow. And I'm using partial hair at the frog and full hair at the tip. So let's see how that works. So if I can do something, one thing that's very much that way is. So that's a very legato line there. Let me see if I can think of another one. Boy, that's sort of something where it really has to continue. Boy, it's like it's sort of hard to kind of think of it out of nowhere. But I mean, I don't know, maybe the A major of Beethoven, like. I don't know if you can see how I'm doing that, but it's anyway. That's sort of a fairly. I know that's maybe a little bit of a complicated answer, but there's a bunch of different elements in there that I talked about, and that the fingers play a role in all of those things. So like I'm kind of partly tilting the hair a little bit at the frog, and then opening up my first finger here, so I'm not kind of holding the bow tightly. I'm just kind of letting it stay on the string. There's another example. Okay, let's see what else we've got here. Tips on getting a good faster or wider vibrato. So faster or wider? Well, I think a lot of that has to do with how good of a contact you have with the string. In other words, and this sort of brings into question the whole concept of vibrato and what is it and why do we do it? Why would we want a faster vibrato or a wider vibrato? What is the actual reason? And I think that's an important thing to think about. And one main aspect of that is if we look at over time the evolution of vibrato and how it came into being a thing that we all do, has a lot to do with the changes in the cello historically from its original, from the beginnings until now. And what has happened to the instrument over time is that it's gotten tighter and tighter and tighter, so that it has more power and more projection. And the reason for that has mainly to do with the evolution of music, because over time, the music has the orchestration, for example, has changed drastically from the time of Bach until, I mean, in Bach's time, there weren't even really, there were orchestral suites, for example, but the instrumentation involved, oboes and horns and strings. And a lot of, even Haydn and Mozart were just oboes and horns often. And then sometimes flute, sometimes clarinet. More and more with Mozart, that became the case. Then Beethoven, more and more brass, more trumpets, trombones, tubas. Wagner ended up, then you have a whole huge complement of brass. And singers singing, very, very powerfully. So the strings changed over time to sort of match what was happening in the orchestration. And as a result, you might hear this, that earlier on, people didn't use vibrato so much, but that was because there was less tension on the strings, and the strings themselves vibrated a lot. They resonated a lot. They just didn't project a lot, but there was a lot of ring. And so when you would play an open string, it would just last a long time. And they did use vibrato, and some people used vibrato more than others at the time, just the same way that it is now. But there wasn't as much of a it wasn't used as much and as often. As the instruments got to make it sound richer, to make it sound like a broader sound and more resonant. And the reason it sounds more resonant is because the fundamental is moving, and so the overtones are spreading out. Okay, so our perception of it is that it's more resonating more. It also changes how the bow responds to the string. I mean, if the left hand is active, the bow behaves differently, and that's just neurological. You can try it for yourself. If you vibrate, like you play a full bow and you vibrate for half of it and then stop halfway through, like that, your bow will act differently, just automatically. So the vibrato isn't about wiggling. It's not about making a note wiggle. It's about making the instrument resonate more. So if that's what it's really for, then the idea is the instrument needs to be resonating optimally to begin with in order for you to be able to really vibrate in a way that's going to be effective, okay? And I know this is not necessarily a trend these days, but the idea being that, for instance, if I take this note, that what I want to do is maximize, and this is probably something that's hard to hear over the internet, but what you want to do is maximize the solidity with which you're holding the string, which means you have to have good structure to begin with, and then from there you put weight into the structure using gravity and arm weight, and then really hold the string down firmly. And if you do that, then you get the instrument to resonate. So then the resonance that you get, then if you just move, see how much I'm moving? I don't really have to move that much, actually. And then I can go slow or fast. It doesn't matter. If I want to go wider just, I mean, you don't have to move that much, really. And then it actually is very effective. If it's, and this is what people get confused about, I think a lot of times, is they think, oh, well, if I need to have more pad on the string, so they play with their fingers flatter. And what ends up happening is you're actually deadening the string. You're not getting it to resonate more. You're kind of flattening it out. And so what ends up happening is the more you move. And it's not that you wouldn't do that. You can do that. It's just a different kind of sound. So like if I flatten it, you can hear the difference. It doesn't have the same focus. And so I have to move more to get the same effect. And so I'm using more pad, but I'm also moving more. So it doesn't make sense. So what I'm actually doing is using the tip of my finger, very tip. And when I'm doing it, and then I can go faster or slower. And if you don't have to move very much, then the speed is not as much of a problem, because then you can just move. You can either move faster or slower without having to work that hard. It just becomes easier to control. And wider, same thing. It's like you don't have to move that much, and I can move very little if I'm really getting a good connection to the string. And it's like, you can barely see me moving. You can probably hear it. It's just, the string is just more sensitive, okay? So that's kind of a big answer for that question, but could be a good way to kind of look at it. Okay, let's see. Shelley, I had an odd question. Don't see the question. Okay. I use one of my schools. I'm considering a graduate school. What are the main things you focus on as teacher with your students? Wow. Okay, I'm looking. Question: has your practice routine changed in any way during this time of quarantine? That's a good question. For right now, let's talk about that for a second. Yes. I want to talk about that with everybody. Like, for everybody that's in quarantine, I mean, everybody feels differently about this, situation. It's for some people, it's incredibly difficult. I mean, for everyone it's difficult, but some people find it harder than others, and so there's such a variety of things that people are experiencing at this time, and it sort of depends. It depends. Are you still working, or are you not working? Are you in school? Are you doing your lessons online? I mean, there's so many different things that are happening right now for people. But for me, when you're saying like practicing, normally my schedule is very, very, very busy. I'm usually packing in lessons, when I'm in Bloomington, as well as taking care of, things with the house, etc. And I get up at usually like 5:30 in the morning, and I start practicing by 6:30 or 7 in order to get some practicing in before the day starts, and I start having to, do all the other things that I have to do with emails and responsibilities at the university, as well as teaching. And I find, for me, it's much better if my head is clear when I'm practicing. If I try to practice at the end of the day, it's not as effective. So early in the morning, when I don't watch the news before, I don't do anything before, so that my brain isn't, sort of caught up with anything, and I can just focus in, and I find that very effective. The basic difference now is all the performing, as you all know, is not happening. So since I'm not performing, and the teaching schedule is I'm teaching a lot, but I can manage the schedule very easily because there's so much more flexibility for me and the students. So I teach in the afternoon, which leaves the whole morning for me to practice. And this is my point. This is going to go on for a while. We all know that. And it's going to be difficult for everyone. no matter who you are, there are gonna be challenges. But what you can do is use the time to where you're not distracted. I mean, there can be a lot of distractions at home, of course, but you can use this time to kind of focus on things that you maybe don't always have time to focus on. I mean, and that could really be anything, but if it's the cello, yeah, I've been able to practice in a way that I haven't had time to do in a long time, and it's been, that's been a benefit, and that's kind of how I see it. As it's one way to kind of make use of the situation that's productive, and I think it feels better than, in a way, it's not better that this is the situation by any means, but just better as in I can really focus. I can use it as an opportunity, and really make the most of it. And I think that's something I would encourage everybody to do to the extent that you can. And so that when we come out of this, you're in good shape, and that means everything from how you're eating, how you're exercising, how you're practicing, what you're reading, what you're paying attention to, all the things that you can do to kind of, really find your center, and strengthen it, while we're in this situation. Okay, so that was kind of an interesting question. Let's see. Question. Hi, for some program. Okay, so somebody is asking about. Okay. Somebody's asking about. I'll just do this real quick. About. Do I meet with students who want to come to IU or are interested in studying with me? And I just want to say, I do. And I can do it virtually. I can do it in person. If we're not in quarantine, then, and our travel restrictions, then when I'm traveling, I'm very often on the East Coast, and I'm also on the West Coast. So, and then other places too. So, if there's a student, I try to meet you where you are, if at all possible. But if not, we can meet virtually or come to IU, and I always recommend that because you should probably see the school and get a feel for what it's like, and so that you can feel whether or not it's something that interests you. And I always arrange to meet with anybody who wants to meet. And so that's just contact me through my IU email, which you can find at the IU website. Okay. How does a cellist approach passing fast passages? How does a cellist approach fast passages? Okay. You probably know all this stuff. I mean, I use a metronome and make it go faster. That's one way. I use rhythms, which is another way. Oh, but here's a little thing about rhythms that might be interesting for some of you. Okay, so let me see if I can figure something like that would be an example. I don't know. I'm going to probably make it really simple. Okay, so a fast passage, like what's that? Oh, like, maybe something like that. Okay, let's take that for example. So with rhythms, you can do, you do a dotted rhythm. So you do like a group of 2 notes, and you do like a dotted, the equivalent of something like a dotted 16th and a dotted eighth. I'm sorry, a 16th and a dotted eighth, or a dotted eighth and a 16th. But the trick is to do it with the actual amount of bow that you would really use. So if I'm doing that passage, for instance, then I would do like, so I would go, I would stop the bow so that I don't hold the long note. Because a lot of people would do like something like that, and then they would go. So I'm going to show you so you can see the bow a little better. Maybe like, so what I would do is, and then, so you'll notice in the slur, I did, I did that. I stopped in the middle of the slur. So I didn't use, instead of that, I did. So I kept the bow going the same direction, but I used the actual amount of bow that I would use. I don't know, that's, hopefully that's easy to understand. So. And that way you're really feeling what it's like to play those notes in tempo. And then you can expand it to groups of 4 notes. Now this is if it's a divisible by 8. If it's by 3, then you have to do divisions of 3. But if it's divisible by 2, then you would do 4 groups of 4 notes, like something like that, or like that. And part of it is that the fingers, similarly like what I was talking about in the Bach, in between those spaces that you release. Because one of the things that can happen when you're playing very fast is that the fingers start tightening and then they won't move. So the trick is to be able, the speed with which you can release the finger after you strike it is a lot of what makes it go fast. It's when it doesn't release that it starts bogging down and it's harder to move and it's slower. Okay, so you can see I did, so for groups of 4, it would be, and then, and you can see I did the same thing where I broke the slur so that I'm using the right amount of bow. So, and then, so this time I broke the slur 1 note later, like that. And then you do 4. And then you can do groups of 8. So you could do like, and if you really want to go nuts with it, you can move 1 note over for that, like that, you know. I mean, you can go as far with it as you want, but that's a little, maybe a little variation on the idea of using rhythms that could be useful. practice. So, for example, another thing would be like in Dvorak concerto where you have that this thing. So, for example, with triplets, you could do like that. Okay, and then you could do or and then another key with this is if in the midst of doing those variations, you find there's one that kind of gets stuck, that's the real purpose of doing this, because then you find that spot, you've identified where you're actually getting hung up, and then you just focus on that one. And sometimes that involves a discovery of something technical that doesn't quite work in your technique, but because it's in that context, sometimes you can figure it out because you can actually tell why it's not working. And then you can actually learn more about, and then, that can broaden into a more kind of universal thing in your playing that affects everything, and really makes a difference. Okay, so that's an interesting question. Before I drag, change your hand. I don't understand that quite. Okay. Control that a singer has to create a consistent legato, the bow. Okay, I kind of talked about that before already. How can you get the bow to have the control that a singer has to create a consistent legato? Okay, and there's another way to look at that. And I can combine that with a suggestion from one of the viewers about like a piece that is a good example to use, and that's the Brahms C minor piano quartet slow movement, which is a great. Thank you for suggesting that, because that's a good, a very good excerpt that shows legato and how to do legato. What I'm going to say is actually not what you might expect when it says, how can you get your bow to have the control that a singer has to create a consistent legato? I talked about some of the mechanisms of bow changes. Okay, so that I already talked about. What I didn't talk about that could be worth really discussing, and I actually sort of kind of talked about it, but it's actually more about the vibrato and less about, it is about the bow, but it's the left hand that actually can have a real impact on this. And this is about how to continue the life of your left hand through the notes. As I had mentioned before, the bow is very sensitive to what the left hand is doing, especially when it comes to vibrato. If there's activity in the left hand, the bow in the right hand automatically senses that and responds to it very subtly. And that includes if the vibrato stops, the bow will shut off. And so when people say vibrate every note and try to vibrate in between the notes, it's not so that they all wiggle. It's so that the bow continues to sustain through the changes and through the changes of notes as well as through the bow changes. So it's really about the vibrato continuing, I think. And I think you might find that to be true. So how to get the vibrato to continue both within a bow stroke and in between the bow strokes? If the left hand keeps some vibrancy throughout, the bow will continue to sustain, and most likely will sustain in a very legato way, pretty much. And so there is a technique to sort of, and so this is really calls into question, like, so I'm shifting kind of the idea because I really think it does shift in this way when you're talking about legato like a singer, okay? And it is about the bow, but it's what the left hand is doing that kind of directs the bow in often, okay? So let's say the real issue then in this context is how to get the vibrato to continue through the notes. And that has to do with one way to practice that is to vibrate the articulations. So that means if I go from one note to the next, you know, let's say I'm practicing connecting the notes, something like this. Like that. You can hear how you're articulating and whether or not the fingers are articulating equally. Like that. But you can practice vibrating the articulation. So that means that when you put the finger down, you vibrate it like that. You see? And then if you vibrate the articulations, that means that the vibrato is starting immediately on the note when you play it. And so then you can... And then the bow will continue to sustain through the changes of the notes. And what you often see is people will do like they'll kind of play a note and then vibrate like that. Or, you know, kind of, there's a little delay, and that's when you lose that legato. Because even if it's just for a split second, the bow will lose, not lose contact, but the contact won't be the same for that little split second. So like, yeah, so a good example for this would be, you know, Brahms' C minor piano quartet, which somebody suggested. That's got a lot of that in it. So that would be like, I'll demo it so you can see the left hand doing it. See how that works? So I'm kind of, oh, and then if I go on, so you can see that basically it's not stopping between the notes, and then the bow goes through. Okay. Okay. Last yet getting a good sound in this position, huh? Let's see. I'm going to keep doing this. Let's see. Okay. At what point during the process of learning a piece, should you memorize it? Should you try to memorize it right out the gate, or once you've learned all the notes to some degree? Well, if you haven't learned all the notes, you probably can't memorize it. I mean, no, I mean, sorry. No, memorizing, what I would recommend is start trying to play it from memory as soon as you can. If it's going to be a piece that you're going to have to play from memory, you want to get used to it. And, you know, I often find this, you know, people are sometimes reluctant to try to do that. They feel, I think they're concerned about it, and then so they put it off and they wait, and it, you know, it depends, and everybody's different with this. Some, you know, you may find that you can memorize something, you know, you're playing it, and then, you know, try just looking away from the music and see if you can do it. And if you make a mistake, that's okay. Just look back, you know. But the sooner the better, I think, if it's going to be from memory, like a Bach suite, a concerto, anything like that. But you also have to, if it's a concerto and things, you got to memorize the dynamics. You got to memorize the markings, because that's sort of, you know, something that sometimes people overlook. And so you want to make sure that it's not just the notes that you're memorizing or the fingerings or whatever, but it's the whole picture. And, you know, if you're trying to do it, you're kind of, I mean, I would suggest that you need to be able to play the piece fairly comfortably, you know, before you should do that, you know, because if it's something very difficult, although sometimes, you know, if it's very difficult, you're practicing it so much, you just memorize it. You know, you kind of can't forget it. But if it's something that, you know, I mean, something I find like that's challenging to memorize, something like a Britten suite. That, I mean, what I've done with that is sort of like line by line, like just kind of see how many lines I can memorize at a time and just kind of layer it, you know, and do one movement at a time and just kind of, you know, in terms of memorization. So anyway, that's a little point there. Let's see, vibrato, its background. Okay, that's good. How do I know that my time of practice is efficient? Sometimes I practice a piece and find the passages that are the most problematic. I practice slowly, as is always said, and then it cuts off. It doesn't really go on to say, I don't think, or maybe if I click on this, I'll get the whole thing. Nope, okay. All right, efficiency in practicing, wow. That is a trial and error endeavor. If you're, you know, it takes, you know, you get better and better and better and better at practicing the more you do it. There's no kind of other way to say it. And sometimes you have to be to learn to be efficient, you have to find out what's inefficient. And that's a pain in the neck, but you kind of have to do it. I think, you know, certainly patience and perseverance are what that's all about. But I think the more you're able to be very specific and get to the heart of a problem or of something that you need to learn, that's efficient. You know, if you're able to kind of really determine, like when I was talking about doing the rhythms, you know, that's kind of like an overall, just kind of get it going technique of practicing. But in the midst of that, you might find there's like one little spot that just kind of gets stuck. And that's what I was talking about. It's being able to identify that. If you get good at finding the little thing that you get caught on, that sort of just, and it can investigate it and then are willing to explore doing it differently, and trying it different ways and that kind of thing. I think that's the best I can say about being efficient. I mean, ideally, it's just that you can identify a problem like perfectly. I mean, it's really hard to do. I mean, and it depends on the circumstances. Sometimes it's not so hard to do, but a lot of times it's hard to really tell exactly what it is. But you need to kind of be searching for that, and sometimes that search might take a long time, but it is efficient in a sense. And I think the slow way is the fast way. I think when people just try to, over and over again play something, the worst thing you can do is spend a lot of time practicing something badly. That's got to be the worst thing. And sometimes, and I've done it. I speak from experience. I have, gone way down a road and then realized, wow, that's not going to ever work. And so, but yeah, I think that's mainly the best answer I can think of for that at the moment. Okay. Let's see. How do I keep your hand from sliding on your... Oh, yeah. Okay. How do I keep your hand... How do I keep my hand from sliding on the bow? And the grip is different. Your bow looks much more stable. Okay, it actually is not that long of an answer. It kind of depends on how it slips, but this is the most common thing that happens for people that have trouble with their hands slipping. Hopefully it's what you're talking about, because I mean, it could slip in a lot of different ways, but one of the most common things is this. Okay, so when you're coming into the frog, if the elbow drops, then the hand automatically does this, unless I force it, by bending the wrist to kind of stay like that. But that's kind of an awkward thing to do. So a lot of times what people do is they drop their elbow and then the hand does this. And when it does that, and it supinates like that, then these fingers here ever so slightly slide forward like that, just a little bit. And then when you go out to the tip, they kind of right themselves and then turn that way. Then when they come in and they go down again, they slide again. And eventually you get this thing where you're like, going like that. And so one of the ways to do this, to help avoid that, is to give some suspension to the elbow at the frog. So in other words, as you come in, just a little bit of suspension. That way the hand doesn't fall over. See how that works? It's just, instead of doing this. And a lot of people, and I can do that too. It doesn't have to cause your hand to slip, but a lot of times it for a lot of people it does. So they come into the frog and then they slip. So if you just give a little bit of suspension to the elbow, and I say suspension because that kind of refers back to what we were talking about at the beginning about the lat muscle suspending the shoulder. Okay, so the lat, I'm using the back to hold the shoulder up, so that when I have the elbows up a little bit, I'm not pulling it up with my shoulder. I'm just letting it I'm supporting it from the back. And then it doesn't, it really, it won't slip as much. If that's what you mean. There's other kinds of slipping. I know there's like slipping where you slide through and that kind of thing. But that also has to do with a lot of times at the elbow. If it's happening in your hand, it's not how you're holding it, but it's more like what your arm is doing. that is causing your hand to do that. Usually it has to do with the arm, the movement of the arm, or the position of the arm. I always struggle when I play bass. Oh. Okay, so here's a question about Bach interpretation, how to phrase it. Okay, so it's a big, big subject, but I'm going to just touch on this by saying that it's really important to understand that it is a polyphonic piece of music and not a melody. It is polyphonic. That means there are multiple voices all the time that are present. And so, and also in that period of music, the way it's designed around the meter. And in that period, that is simply how it was conceived. In other words, strong beats and weak beats. So a lot of things in playing music from that period are already kind of built into it, but you have to understand that that's how it's designed, and then it kind of makes sense. So you'll notice, particularly in the preludes, but almost every, if you look at the preludes tell you a lot, and especially if you compare them, you can really get a very good idea about what he was going for in each suite individually, based on the way he voices the preludes, okay? But that aside for a moment, what you'll often notice is that he begins the bar with the bass note, okay? And then he'll either bring in the fifth or the third, or, it might be the third first and then the fifth, or the fifth first and then the third, something like that, okay? Almost always, right? And because that's a strong beat, it gets more emphasis. So the phrasing isn't exactly through the bar, but it's from one bar to the next bar. In other words, what kind of directs the phrase is that bass line that's put on each downbeat, or how the voices move around that bass line, okay? So if you follow the bass line, the lowest note, you can see what the direction of it, how it's modulating, and also just exactly what he's intending. I think one of the really good sequences is that in the D minor suite, right after the opening, when he does the circle of fifths, going from where he manages to go from D minor to F major, and he starts by, after the opening, he drops down a third to the B flat. So you'll notice every downbeat is a bass note. And if you follow that, it's going. And then it eventually gets to C, and then F. But before it gets to C, he moves almost completely chromatically from G to C. So he purposefully expands that last fifth to cover a much longer, so he gives much more emphasis to the dominant, if you're familiar with harmony enough to know what that means. But if so he does. So from all the other ones, it's just, and then, but it's, see what I mean? So he makes the last fifth, 4 times as long, by adding all those steps in between. And it's a little tricky because they're not all on the downbeats there, but they're there. The lowest note is what is what it is. So, and there really aren't a whole lot of, you can interpret it a lot of different ways, but it's all right there. It kind of is fairly clear what that means, because he's expanding that last fifth. And so he wants to give it more emphasis. He wants to create more suspense for the resolution. Okay. So I don't know if that helps you. It's a little bit complicated, but if you do have to know some theory, it does help. And so the analysis, but you don't have to necessarily analyze every single aspect of it. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea. There's more to that, of course, but there's another thing. Okay. So shallow callers. Oh, okay. So as someone who has been behind the curtain, oh yeah, many times, what do you look for in a particular professional orchestra, in particular in professional orchestral auditions, and how do you recommend developing those skills? Okay. So he says behind the curtain, someone who has been behind the curtain. What that means is, a lot of you know what that means, but those who don't know, that means that when you audition for a professional orchestra, you play behind a curtain. So nobody sees you. And the idea is that way, ideally, there's no bias of any kind about the person, whatever that might be in anybody's mind. All they hear is the sound. And so there's no visual cues of any kind to sort of that influence the decision. So behind the curtain means that you're playing orchestral excerpts for an audition for a professional orchestra. And it's hard to answer, really answer it. But I think, okay, here's one way to kind of answer it. All right, so there are things that more or less everybody can kind of agree on. And that right there is the problem, is that everybody has a different idea of what it is they want to hear, right? So when you're playing for an audition committee, you have a whole bunch of different opinions of what needs to be happening, And for people to come to a consensus on a person, takes a lot, you know, for someone to be totally convincing. And, you know, because, I mean, I even had one situation where I was sitting on a committee where, you know, somebody would play something and the rhythm was really good. And then the conductor would say, can you play that again and pay attention to the rhythm? And I was like, what? Like, why do you say that? I thought the rhythm was really good. That was the thing that was really good about that, you know? And then somebody else would play and very, very good phrasing and really lyrical and really legato and stuff. He goes, can you play it again and do it with more line, like make it more legato? And I'd be like, and after a while I started realizing, oh my God, he hears them doing it and then he thinks that he thought it. It was just like, how can you possibly win an audition when somebody is doing that? You know what I mean? So just take heart that you really have no idea what's going on behind the curtain on the other side. Okay. But, you know, and so this is it's very hard in a lot of ways, but the most important thing is the fundamental things need to be taken care of. You know, the intonation needs to be really, really as spotless as you can make it. That doesn't mean like if there's a little mistake or something, that's the end of it. It's because what I think really is a defining factor in somebody who's doing well in auditions is they have so many things that are appealing about the way they play. You know, their intonation is really, really beautiful. They, you know, don't have any problems with rhythm or their sense of pulse is very, you know, they don't drag, they don't rush, they don't, you know, they don't have any like quirks with their rhythm. They, you know, when they have a dotted rhythm, it's precise, and you know, they have a sense of the piece, the style of the piece. You know, that's a taste thing in a lot of cases. But you know, I mean, the more familiar you are with the idiom, like if you're playing a Beethoven symphony, if you know all the Beethoven symphonies, you've listened to all of them, and you've heard different recordings, and hopefully you played them. But if you haven't, like at least that you really are well versed in Beethoven in general, or any composer, not just that piece, but that composer. Like listen to other stuff by the composer, not just the piece that you're playing, you know? So you kind of get a vibe of who that is. So that's this sort of the style thing and your kind of take on it. The more you know, the more informed you are, the better that'll probably be. Okay, so there's that. You know, variety of articulation, being able to, and that gets into sort of techniques. Like if there are weak points in your technique, either you need to straighten them out or you need to be really, really good at hiding them. One or the other. Because, you know, everybody has some like weak point in their technique. Everybody. There isn't anybody, and no matter how good they are. They just don't let you know that they're doing what that is. They have you paying attention to something else that's really good, you know. So that's kind of part of it, in a way. Like the quality of your sound, you know, and then your overall musicianship and artistry, like really are, like if you've got the more of that you have, like people do want that. You know, they don't want somebody who just plays like a robot. They really do want a musician, you know, somebody that's going to, you know, especially conductors, because they don't want to have to tell you every single thing. They want to talk about the fine points. They don't want to have to, they definitely don't want to have to tell you how to play dynamics. They don't, then I forgot to mention that dynamics, make sure that dynamics are very audible, and that there's a real difference between piano and pianissimo and all that kind of stuff that has to be absolutely clear. All of that stuff. So all of those things are just very, very important. So hopefully that kind of hits on the overall scenario there. That you're kind of making sure that everything is in order, but that also that you're kind of immersed in that particular piece when you're playing it, and that you have a sense of that composer's work and their particular language, musical language, and have some sense of it. It doesn't have to be something that you define. It's just that you're very familiar with it. And, so you can listen to their piano repertoire, you can listen to their vocal repertoire, just all of it, because people often ask this question, like, what recording should I listen to? It's like, why don't you just listen to other pieces by Beethoven? Like, just listen, or like when people say, like, which recording of, this particular cello piece do you listen to? It's like, don't listen to another cellist playing the piece. Listen to all the other stuff that composer wrote and get to know the idiom. You need to be the one who's interpreting, not trying to do somebody else's interpretation. You can't, it's just know that composer well, by knowing the sort of the scope of their writing. That can be helpful. And lastly, when you're playing the piece, you need to be hearing it. You need to have the orchestra with you playing it, so you're not just focused on every single note that you're doing by yourself. You have to be really playing the piece and experiencing it. It's really happening right then. So you have to practice that way when you're running through it, that you're hearing the whole orchestra around you when you're playing it. Otherwise, it's going to feel really lonely out there, and you can start to feel really uncomfortable. Okay, so hopefully that helps with that question. Okay, let's see. Question. Hello. Just started oh my God! Wow. Keep the. Oh, this is a good one. Oh boy. Okay. All right. So this is a little thumb position thing. Okay. First position. First finger in thumb position. Okay. All right. So, so when you're going from thumb to first finger, or like your thumb has to be in a certain place, and then you have to play your first finger, or you have to play like even a half step, let's say. Okay. I'll just throw this out there about thumb position in general, and then maybe it'll be helpful. But at a certain point, I've messed around with my thumb for. But think when I first started doing thumb position, I woke up in the middle of the night, and I couldn't breathe because something was poking into my lungs. I had been straining to. It was horrible. So I've been through the ringer with the thumb, but I use my thumb all the time now. My students know this. I like to use it a lot. So, but what I do is actually, I don't. A lot of people, when they play thumb position, they play kind of on the edge like this, and then they kind of do that. I actually play like that. So if you look at it from the side, I'm actually playing kind of more on this part of the thumb. Oh, wait, you can't see that. So I'm playing like, let's see, here, like more here, not here, but like here. So I turn it over like this. And that way, if you turn it this way, then it gives you, it's very easy to access your first finger. Like that, see? It is a little bit weird to learn how to do it. It's not, I wish I could say that it was really easy to kind of learn how to do that, but it's not. It kind of, because it's a little bit awkward, but it gets easier. And then just the way anything with thumb does, it always was hard to start, but once you start to get stronger, you develop the supporting musculature that you need pretty much to do anything with it. But I'll get to that in a minute, but let's just talk about like the actual thing, the question, with the first finger and the thumb. So as you can see, I'm kind of, if I exaggerate it, it's like I'm playing like kind of more like this, right? And then I put my first finger down like that instead of doing this, okay? So it's like this. And the question is, do I break the joint? Like, do I do that? Like, and actually that joint for me doesn't break that much. So, but what I'm saying is if you do this, then you don't have to as much, or at all. And you can really get the fingertip onto the string. Like, you see how that works? Or you can do a half step, and I can still get my fingertip there. So it sounds, but you have to be willing to move your hand. So, because you can't hold it in a position exactly. You have to kind of, see how I'm doing that? But I can even vibrate it. So I'm not like playing on the fingernail. But if you're doing thirds, then I find a lot of times I have to break it in order to reach, like if I'm playing from like that, I kind of have to break it, in order to get the tip there. If I'm reaching way back like that, so that's, something to kind of explore the different ways that you can actually, you can use your thumb in a way where you can kind of create more space for your first finger to kind of really, and it's also a little bit more kind of gravitationally sensible, because then your hand is kind of pointing down at the ground instead of pointing in at yourself. It's like you're kind of not pushing this way, you're just kind of resting on it more. So it ends up feeling a lot easier in the end, because you're kind of more connected to gravity in the left hand. And there's a little something about that. Okay, here's the thing about intonation. Can you please speak a little more about the types of intonation and recommendations on how to practice and improve intonation? Okay. All right, so I pretty much kind of stick with tempered intonation for the most part. And which means that the half steps are even. And it not all the time, but the vast majority of the time. And there's a very simple reason why, because the role of the cello and the range of the cello different roles that it plays. Almost always involve, very often if you're in a quartet, it's the bass line. Most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time. If you're playing with piano, the piano is tuned tempered. If you're playing in an orchestra, depending on how good the orchestra is, you kind of just have to match what's going on. You have to be flexible and be able to kind of adjust. But you have to know from where you are adjusting in order to be able to do that. So you have to have a really solid sense of pitch in order to do that. And so as so many people do, and for many years I didn't do this because it didn't really, it wasn't so readily available, but I use a tuner. I use a tuner to help me kind of find, to really be sure about where the pitch is, and it's tempered. The exceptions are intervals. If you're playing double stops, then it's a matter of taste a little bit. Some people want to hear them a certain way, and some people want to hear them another way. And so there is some variation there, of course. But I think, for example, if it's a third, then more often than not, it's the low note that needs to be really centered in a more or less a tempered way. And the third can be that the upper note can sort of adjust to that. If it's a sixth, often it's the top note that's the tonic note, and the lower note adjusts to that. But depending on what you're playing with, and what the situation is, you might have to adjust that. You always have to be able to adjust. But I think having a strong sense of what it is to begin with yourself is the best way to go, because then at least you can hear the difference between what you're expecting to hear and what's actually going on. And then you're able to kind of make that leap, very quickly, because you can tell the difference. That's higher, that's lower, you can just immediately do it. And what's become very clear to me is over time is just that intonation is memorization. Like you actually remember the frequencies. It is possible to memorize a frequency. And it's really extraordinary how, with the kind of precision that's possible with the brain, just neurologically, to sort of connect an actual posture with a sound. And it doesn't mean that you're always going to, be absolutely perfect with it, but the more refined that is, the more likely it is to be to sound very accurate, right? And so if you think about it from like you're memorizing something, it's not like you're memorizing where it is, you're remembering what it sounds like. And to sort of try that out, like, can you remember the pitch? And so with a tuner, for example, you'd like tune a certain note, right? And you play it and listen to it, and then play something else or whatever. And then without looking at the tuner, play the note again and see if you can remember exactly what it sounded like. Not where it is. It doesn't matter if you put it exactly in the right place at first. Just find what the pitch was that you heard. Just try to find it exactly like the way, and then see the tuner and see what the difference between the way you remember it and what the tuner says. And that can actually be really improved just by doing it. It's painstaking and difficult. For some people it's not. Some people are very, very good at it right away, and some people it's it's more effort, but it can be very, very effortful and painstaking. But if you stick with it, it does happen. It does get better and better and better. You have to be really consistent about it. If you just have to keep doing it, and eventually it starts to become more and more familiar. And if you kind of let it go, it'll start to warp a little bit sometimes, and it depends. Some people, can hear frequencies like right away, like they know exactly, precisely the frequency they're hearing, and so they can find that immediately. But if that's not the case, you can train your ear to do that. Okay, so that's something to think about. Let's see. Let's see. People are saying hello. Hi, everyone. Okay. Okay. How do you find and keep the fine line of performance practice and the modern approach while maintaining a fine line for interpretation of Bach cello suites? Okay. Okay, so this is another Bach question. I'll just talk about it for a second. It's about performance practice. For me, my knowledge of performance practice is pretty peripheral in terms of it's mainly comes from being around it and hearing it. It's not like actually studying it, on Baroque cello. That I have not done. But I've heard it. I've heard lots and lots of playing on period instruments, and I did have some lessons with Honor Belsma, but on modern cello, not but we were doing earlier music. So what I've kind of come to with this is that the modern cello does not function like a Baroque cello, really. It's very different. And to play it like a Baroque cello exactly makes no sense. It doesn't, it's just not like that. It isn't that kind of instrument. That's my opinion. And probably a lot of people would agree with me on that, but so, for example, like people say, oh, don't vibrate at all when you're playing, Bach. And honestly, it's not that I think, and I talked about vibrato earlier in this, so if you're interested in that, you can always see that. But because the way I think of vibrato is not just wiggling. I'm not thinking about wiggling notes. It's all about resonance and sustaining. So I think if you're playing Bach on a modern cello and you don't vibrate, it's actually less like a Baroque cello than if you vibrate a little, and make sure that everything is really resonating and sustaining. Because the whole problem with a modern cello when you're playing Bach is that the notes don't sustain the way they do on a Baroque cello. And so you don't hear the harmonic, you don't hear the chords that are actually happening as you're playing it. You just it gets real focused on individual notes. And so you have to sort of create a little bit of that sense of resonance, particularly in the bass, by two things: making sure that you're sustaining the notes long enough that they're really heard and that, they don't just get lost, and vibrating them a little so that to help you, kind of hold the sound of the note, but but just a little, so that it's not flat. Because it's not that the wiggling is important, it's the bow. If you just do that, the bow is not going to have the same kind of contact as if you vibrate. It's just, you have to try it to see, but I think you will find, anybody will find this, it's two different feelings. If the left hand is inactive and if the left hand is active, the bow responds differently. And it will kind of hold on to the resonance a little bit longer, to hold the note a little bit longer, sustain it a little longer. And that's more like what a Baroque cello actually sounds like, even though they don't vibrate as much, or maybe at all, in some people maybe, right? So that's kind of the answer there. And something I didn't touch on earlier, which I want to just not make sure I mention and don't forget about, is the balance between the bass and the treble in Bach is a big challenge on a modern cello. Probably on a Baroque cello to some extent too, but definitely on a modern cello. It ends up sounding louder on the top and softer on the bottom, over and over and over again. And so that's how you get this sort of up and down, constant kind of arcs that then it just sounds like a melody that just goes up and down over and over and over again. The idea is to give the bass enough substance and enough presence that you hear that along with the top line as one thing happening together. So you have to lighten the top more often than not in order for the whole thing to sort of be perceived as polyphonic. Okay, that's the period instrument question there. Very brief. Anything else? Talk about a bit. Warming up. Okay, there's a warming up question. Hello, I studied cello in college. I was just wondering if you could talk about warming up. Okay. Okay. I think what I would maybe recommend is to start would be just open strings. Just start with the bow. Just kind of just kind of feel so that you kind of get the bow set up for being very relaxed and just comfortable, as the best you can do. And then maybe a scale, starting with a scale, just one note at a time. They're just very, very slow and easy. And then add a little vibrato, and then speed it up a little bit. Just letting your hands kind of get into it gradually, and you can kind of feel how everything is starting, the muscles are starting to kind of activate, if you do it gradually. So I think a scale is good because it covers the whole range, and it's simple enough that you don't, you're likely to be able to kind of focus on being relaxed and keeping your posture good and stay as loose as you can as you go faster. I mean, I think there's a lot of other little stuff that you can do. I mean, I have a lot of other exercises but I wouldn't, that gets very involved to talk about that right now. But I mean, there are lots of little exercises that I think you can add into that as well. Like figure articulation exercises. Anyway, that's just a fairly short answer to that question. That is something to try. looks like we've got most of these. Oh, this one. Okay. Here's a question. When I'm practicing slowly, should I practice in slow motion? In particular, should I slow down the vibrato as well? That's kind of interesting. I've never done that. Where I like play with a slower vibrato and slower. Try it. I mean, I want to try that myself. I've never done that. I like that. That's funny. Yeah. I mean, maybe. I have no experience with that. I've never. Okay. Well, here's something. I have done it like where sometimes when okay, so I do have an answer for this maybe. Okay, so here's, an idea. When you're practicing slowly, I think one of the primary, there are several things that you can kind of do when you're going really, really slow. You have time to really pay attention to your intonation and make sure it is precise. Okay. You also have time to examine your technique. How are you sitting? How are you tense? Are you relaxed? Is it feeling? Is there anything that feels like it needs to let go a little bit? Can you do it a little more easily? Any of those things. Or let's say you're specifically working on a technique, like you're trying to, make sure that you sit up, or you're trying to, all these different things. It gives you a chance to focus on those things. And then as you go faster, the trick is to not go too fast too soon. But when you talk about vibrato, I would, sometimes I practice, if it's really slow and I'm doing intonation, I do it without vibrato initially, just to make sure I have everything really centered. And then add the vibrato very gradually as it starts to get faster to kind of, make sure that, because that I'm not obscuring anything in terms of the pitch. But there's one phrase I think, I learned from one of my teachers that I really like, and that is least effort, best result. And what I love about that phrase is that it can really apply to anyone at any time. Because ultimately you want to get a good result. And depending on how you're playing or what you know about playing or how advanced you are or how much you've developed, you may or may not have, all the tools that you need to get a result with very little effort, let's say. If you need to make effort to get the sound that you want, it does require some effort. The trick is exactly how much, you really want to find the minimum that you have to do to really get the result, right? So but you need the result, and you may need it for a performance. And so, it doesn't make sense to go out there and play in some way that's relaxed, that doesn't sound good, or that you're not happy with. That's not the answer. So if it's possible to find an easier way, or to release something and still get that result, that's a step in the right direction. But you haven't sacrificed the quality of what you're doing, or the result, So I think that's kind of an overall thing to think about. So like, if you're going really slowly, you're working on your pitch and you're working on stuff, see if there are things you can do to make it easier while you're doing that, and then you're getting the best result with a little less effort. Each step of the way that you do that leads you to another level of that. And as that goes on, eventually it gets much easier. And that's something that another little phrase that Dorothy DeLay said, who was a great violin teacher, if you don't know who that is. She said, violin playing is easy. It just takes a lot of time. So I think that it kind of sums it up right there in a way. It gets easier and easier and easier gradually if you keep seeking it, but you don't have to sacrifice your result. And if it means at any given time you need to make a little more effort to get the result you want, that's okay, do it, but keep trying to find an easier way. Okay, let's see. Okay, let's see. Lost my parents in there. I think I pretty much answered most of these. There are a couple other little ones. And all right. I'm sorry, I'm just reading all of that. See if there's anything else to kind of all right, here's a little one that we can do. How can I control the angle of the bow when I'm playing a piece or a study fast? And it says popper 1. I think that's kind of off the string, right? I mean, more or less, right? I mean, the angle of the bow, okay, basically the bow goes where you point it. So because it's a straight line, it just moves in whatever direction. In other words, if I point it like this, it goes like that, because it doesn't correct itself, right? Or if I'm doing an up bow and I point it like that, it goes like this, right? If I point it this way, it goes like that. If I point it this way, it goes like that. So depending on what you want the bow to do, you just point it that way. So if you want it to go towards the bridge, you point it towards the bridge, and then you straighten it, or it'll just keep going. All right, so point towards the bridge, it goes to the bridge. If you want to go away from the bridge, point it away from the bridge. The tricky part is on the up bow, the frog becomes the pointing thing. That becomes the tip. So you have to think, if you want the bow to go to the bridge, you have to point the frog towards the bridge. So people get confused by that, but that's the deal. So anyway I want it to go, it doesn't matter. It'll just go wherever I point it. And so you can do that with your fingers, you can do it with your wrists, depending on what kind of seems to work for you. But that's kind of the thing with the bow angle. If you're playing fast, generally the strings tend to speak better when the bow is going in the direction of the bridge than if it's going away from the bridge. So the string you catch the string more easily if you point it towards the bridge than if you do that. It still works, but it goes away from the bridge. The up bow then is like this, so that's kind of helps it to speak. So if you're playing something fast, you can practice it slower, kind of like that. And then you don't actually do that much, but you do it a tiny bit, and it kind of helps catch the string. That's another. Okay, so that was one. All right, let's see. We talked about that. about that. Okay, so many things. We talked about a lot of stuff. All right, one about short articulations. I'm kind of assuming that's sort of bouncing the bow. And they're talking about, this faster, so. The bouncing there, I guess, so. Oh, wait. Okay, so basically, the bow, the way I learned it is that when you're bouncing the bow, what you want to feel is the reaction of the spring of the bow when it's dropped on the string, and the string kind of acts like a trampoline and throws the bow back up again. And the hair is tight enough, it kind of rebounds, right? So you kind of let it drop and then come back up again. And the way I learned it was basically that, like, you kind of drop the wrist, like that, and then feel how the bow kind of reacts to the string, and let it just do that, and let it come back up again. And then you kind of re-engage with it after it does that. So you bring it back up to the same position, and then you just move the arm horizontally. That's how I learned it. And it's so that you're kind of tuned into how the bow responds to the string when it hits it. So it's kind of like a trampoline, and just being because you use that to help the bow bounce, basically. And then how much hair you put on the string, like if you put like flat hair or tilted hair, it will, if it's flat, it'll hit the bow, it'll hit the string a little harder. If it's tilted, that's more of a brush. So depending on how kind of sharp you want the articulation to be, you either kind of flatten the hair a little more or tilt it, and you can feel the difference. Like you can do it very brush, kind of like that, or that's flat. Okay. That's a little thing about bouncing the bow. Okay. Okay, I think I have answered most of these. Okay, there's one about there's one about internal pulse. Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about that. That's an interesting question. It's a challenging question. But yeah. Okay. Internal pulse. So, and it's in regarding orchestral excerpts. So when you're in an orchestral audition, you're going from one piece to another, they're kind of saying, I think it says, how do you make sure, switching from excerpt to excerpt, that you find the correct tempo for each one? Okay. Well, let's say that the tempo that you want it to be, that I think that part of the question, I would say you need to practice by yourself going from one to the next to see what happens. And you should probably be able to tell if the way it feels is different. Like you can tell if you're playing it faster or slower, right? Like, I mean, you'll know. But if you try, like, maybe change the order of them and then do it and then see what happens, like, do you have a tendency to, go one way or the other depending on what you're playing and what order it is? And if you practice that, then you're not surprised when you get into the audition. You kind of know what to expect. But as far as internal pulse, this is kind of interesting to talk about because there's you try to pre-practice with the metronome, you do all these things to kind of like, make the pulse consistent, right? And we spend a lot of time working on that, getting it to be consistent and feeling it and making sure. And then ultimately, you don't really want that to be that much of a dominating thing in most things that you play, you want that to be sublimated. So you're sensing it, but you're not, actually actively doing it. It's more sensing it, but playing through the pulse, that it's linear. There's a linear aspect. There always has to be a linear aspect of some kind. It shouldn't be, well, some pieces are more grounded in the pulse in certain ways, where there's a real strong sense of the meter, right? But if it's a melodic thing, then it kind of has to, feel as if it's somewhat liberated from that, and that's sort of a challenging thing, how to kind of get it. And, using a metronome helps, but it's not always great. If you play something literally like the way you play it with a metronome, I think this, like most of you, like it ends up not sounding good. It doesn't breathe, right? It just is like a run-on sentence. There's no sense of phrasing. So I don't know. I guess maybe that answers some question. I'm not sure if it quite answers the question, but I think one of the things was just switching from one piece to another. And I think that's just something you have to practice at home before you go there, so that when you're there, you don't suddenly get caught off guard, try switching the order of the excerpts around, by yourself, and then see what happens, see if you're able to do that. And if you're not, just keep working with that. Okay. How do you feel about low major sevenths and low major thirds in Bach? I learned initially, my teacher when I was in high school was very much a kind of a Casals disciple, and he, really believed in the half steps being close together, and was very much into that, and it was sort of ingrained in me to do that, and that was a fascinating thing that trend. I mean, it was like a lot of people were doing that I'm talking in the 70s, 80s, but in the 70s really, and earlier. By the 80s, it was kind of going out of fashion, and people started just thinking that sounded out of tune, and I had to kind of shift over to more tempered and So, but one thing maybe I forgot to say this when I was talking about intonation, and I was talking about, the tempered thing and how oftentimes if you're playing with piano, it's, tempered, or if you're playing in a quartet, you're playing a bass line, you gotta, if you move around too much, it throws everybody else off above you. But what I didn't say was when you're playing by yourself, it's a little different because you're the one who really can determine what you want the tonality to be like. You don't have to match it to anything else. You don't have to adjust to anything else. You just to make sure you certainly want it to sound, the D that you're playing down here, you want it to be the same D you're playing up there, But other than that, I mean, how you express the tonality, you do have some room to kind of explore that. And that's a matter of taste. How much one wants to do that, that's how you want to hear it. And the other thing I would say is that certain notes have more flexibility than others, like a neighbor tone. For example, if it's an upper neighbor, lower neighbor, half step or something, it could be more close together, even melodically speaking. That's something that's not going to be that critical. If it's a fundamental, if it's like the tonic or it's a third, then it gets a little trickier if you're playing with a piano or something. Also, if you're the top line, if you're the highest voice, you have more flexibility as well, as far as like the closeness of neighbor tones and things like that. It's less of an issue because you're not playing, you're playing inside of the overtone series of the lower notes. But you're not creating the overtone series, that has to be, for the people above you. So that's a little different. So that's just a little maybe interesting thing to think about in terms of intonation. Okay. So how to remain agile and feel light while still maintaining accuracy in thumb position. Okay, a little touch on this. I think one of the things is when you're in thumb position, this, and maybe this might be very obvious, but if it's not, then it's worth thinking about. Not to hold the thumb down all the time. Like when you're playing other fingers, let go of it. You don't necessarily need to move it, but release it. So that way, the balance is shifting through the fingers rather than always being, like you're holding that and then playing your fingers. That tends to make it tighter and less agile and less comfortable. And sometimes it can, if you're holding that down and trying to play the other fingers, it can pull the other fingers out of tune a little bit because you're not kind of able to kind of reach things as easily because you're kind of, there's one part of your hand that's fixed. So just not holding it down, hold it like any finger, hold it down when you're using it, and when you're not, release it. I think in thumb position, it's good to sort of keep it more or less in place, but you don't necessarily have to hold it down in order to keep it in place. So that might be kind of a helpful thing for thumb position in general. Oh, funny. Okay. All right. So can you give tips on how to phrase big and clearly? I like that. The big is capitalized, all caps. How to phrase big and clearly? Well, Phrase big. It kind of depends on what you're playing, right? I mean, phrase, well, first of all, phrase big, I'm not really sure exactly what that means, but let's say it means just like that so that could mean like a long phrase, or I'm not really sure. I'm a little confused about the question. Because I don't know what phrase big means, um, or clearly. Anyway, but one thing I can say is um, something that I encounter, and more often than not, when and you'll know what I mean when I say this. You listen to a tape of yourself and you think you're doing all these things, and then you hear it and it doesn't sound like you're doing any of those things. So assuming that it's a good enough recording device or whatever that, is able to kind of sort of, what's the word, pick up enough subtleties that you can hear the things. If it's not coming out as much as you think, I mean, then what that means is like phrasing is a physical event on a string instrument. It's something that you literally physically have to do. If you just think it, there are rare examples of people who everything that they think comes immediately through their playing. That is very rare. I mean, rare. Usually there has to be a certain point where you begin to realize that you have to, for lack of a better word, exaggerate the things that you want to be heard. And that means physically do things to make sure that they actually project. Increasing the intensity of the vibrato, changing the position of the bow on the string, like changing your sounding point, all those things to kind of shape, to get to shape the phrase. It requires an actual effort like that. And that's something, that's where your teacher comes in as kind of a sounding board for that. And if you don't have a teacher, if you're like kind of, or you're out of school or something, you're doing, and it's somebody that you trust that and you kind of, play for them, and then they kind of tell you need to do, like, they kind of reflect, and then you sort of get a sense of, because you can't really hear yourself out there. You don't know what you actually sound like at a distance. But over time, you develop more and more and more of a sense of that, like what it actually takes here to get it to sound out there a certain way. And that's kind of getting feedback and then doing it again and gradually learning what it actually feels like to really project a phrase, or a shape, or anything, a color, an intensity, or any kind of variety, or range, or all of those things, intensity levels, and all those things that kind of how to really get them across. There has to be, and you can't tape yourself, but it's not quite the same as getting like actual feedback, because, as I said, it really depends on the equipment to some extent. It's not going to give you an exact, reading of what you're doing, but to some extent it can. So it's better than nothing, let's say. But I think having actual consistent feedback with a teacher is a really good thing. That's kind of what that's all about. And you're just getting one person's opinion of what it should be, and then you go play for somebody else and like, whoa, wow, that's like really outrageous what you're doing. Like, that's too much. So then you start to kind of, over time, it starts to become very clear, like what really seems to be effective. Okay. All right. Okay. So now, okay, I'm getting to the point now where I think I'd better wrap it up. And I think I've answered almost all of these questions. There might be a few little ones that I haven't gotten to yet, but I think that's really good, if I didn't get to your question, I'm sorry. I guess there's always maybe another time. um, I think I'm going to sign off now. Um, but thank you all for joining me tonight. It was fun to kind of take your questions and answer them. And um, I hope you're all doing well and that you're healthy and that you stay healthy. Um, and that remember, this isn't going to last forever. It's going to end eventually. It might be a while, but it will, and you'll be out and about again. And until then, you have some time to explore things at home. Okay. Good to hear from all of you. Good night.